Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now in the drum tap section to a little poem called Not the Pilot. This is the 19th poem of the 43 of drum taps. And in many ways we're working from Barnegat to O Captain in a poem like this. The idea is that we're going to look at how a boat or ship gets piloted. And we're going to think about issues of what Plato calls in Republic 6, the ship of state, and how that will work. This poem is also one of those moments when Whitman begins to think about his own poetic project as something larger than himself, as we have said all the way through our study of Leaves of Grass. Now, I want to remind you that in one of those early poems to the O Cause, Whitman said, "My book and the war are one." And we're going to see again in this poem how actually close that is to accuracy. Now, the assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist, and everything from inscriptions up through and including an introductory set of comments for drum taps. And then we just finished as Toilsome. Now, our Nortons will tell us about this poem, that it appeared untitled in the 1860 group Debris and was given its present title in 1867. In Leaves of Grass 71, it was transferred to drum taps with a revision of the final line, which was again improved for the final version of Leaves of Grass 1881. The announcement of purpose in the fourth line may refer to the forthcoming drum taps, but more likely to all of Leaves of Grass, the battle call for centuries hence. And of course, this idea of calling for peace as a battle call is ironic. Think of it this way. We're basically 25 poems away from O Captain, My Captain. Maybe the most famous of all of the poems of Leaves of Grass, one that Whitman himself struggled to approve of, and especially the public acclaim that he received through the poem. Although he didn't have a problem with utilizing it to gain advancement, which is completely allowable given that he was a poet, as we will read here, who had an agenda. And of course, as we've said this in all of our study of all the great poets and writers, they clearly have some kind of an agenda. Let's enjoy this one, Not the Pilot. Not the pilot has charged himself to bring his ship into port, though beaten back and many times baffled. Not the pathfinder, penetrating inland, weary and long, by deserts parched, snows chilled, rivers wet, perseveres till he reaches his destination. More than I have charged myself, heeded or unheeded, to compose a march for these states, for a battle call, rousing to arms if need be, years, centuries hence. Now, I find this a fascinating poem to place right where it is placed in drum taps. Notice we have two nots here. In other words, the pilot is not alone, the only one. And by the way, again, we'll see this term pilot used in Song of Myself 15, from Pent Up Aching Rivers, and as we have said, Barnegat comes to mind as well. Charged is the key word here, himself. In other words, an agenda. Himself to bring his ship into port. Again, we'll come back to this idea with O Captain, My Captain. By the way, this line from Pent Up Aching Rivers, from the master, the pilot, I yield the vessel to. And I think this idea is central to how we read this poem. He says it, the pilot will often be beaten back and many times baffled. Among the multitude, we'll use this word baffled. We'll come to this word in our next poem, Year That Trembled. Because I think the idea of dim, the idea of unknown, the idea of uncertainty, and of course sudden will play into that as well, is central to our reading of drum taps. I think there was, for Whitman, a moment early on when he stood in maybe an army hospital, and he asked, how did this happen? How did we allow this to happen? I'm baffled by it all. And yet, notice, beaten and many times baffled. Not the pathfinder, the only use of this word in all of Leaves of Grass is right here, and I think that's important because it's a very Dante-esque line, isn't it? Penetrating inland, and then of course weary and long makes all the sense in the world. If you have read drum taps poems up to this point, weary and long makes sense, along with obviously the idea of wretched. By deserts parched, obviously we got all kinds of symbolism going on here. Snows chilled, rivers wet, and then of course the key word of the poem. And I think one of the key words of Whitman's sustained theodicy, as we said. The question of theodicy, dude, why does this suffering have to happen? Why do we have to have bad things happen in the world, like, of course, a horrific 4-year war? And I think this key word of persevere comes to mind. I think of that opening set of lines in the Bhagavad Gita 16, where the word is sometimes translated as persevere, to keep going, to not give up. The word till, key, he reaches his destination. And obviously that's our Homer, that's our Odyssey. That's the idea of getting to Ithaca no matter what. It's going to take a long time to get there, but the pilot says, I'm going to get there. In other words, all of that links with the word not and more. More than I. In other words, there is no pilot who's ever felt more committed to reaching the destination than do I. And now, in what regards? Well, he says, I've charged myself, which is obviously a bit of irony given Song of Myself is the central poem of Leaves of Grass. Heeded or unheeded is an interesting little phrase, because obviously Whitman will sometimes complain, both in his own writing and to his closest pals, that the reception of these poems was not what he had expected. As we have said, and a number of scholars have pointed this out, Whitman genuinely believed with his, can we call it idealism, can we call it optimism? You know, he said he loved the sunny side of life and all of that. I think he genuinely believed that if he could write poems, that somehow the nation would not bifurcate. It would not split, a nation divided against itself and all of that would somehow be avoided with some poetry. And so heeded or not heeded makes sense. Notice he says to compose a march. What is Leaves of Grass? Well, it's a number of things, but it's a march, which is why we keep coming back to things like music and chant and all those other words. For these states, capitalized, obviously this will be not a regional text alone, but a universal text. And of course, becoming a worldwide text when we get to poems like Passage to India. 4, what's the point? A battle call. By the way, one time in all Leaves of Grass, the term battle call gets used, and it's right here. Rousing, we're going to see this word with artilleryman's vision. Rousing to arms if need be. And of course, this to arms, of arms and the man, is the opening lines of the Virgil's Aeneid. So it's interesting the way in which Homer and Virgil influence so much of Whitman's project in Leaves of Grass. And then he says it, years, centuries, hence. And you'll remember this word hence from Song of Myself 46. You're going to find so many echoes from that passage as it relates to the poetic project. In other words, what is it that Whitman really wants to do? Well, I've called it a sustained theodicy. And he uses the word picture of a ship that has to be properly guided by a pilot, and in this case the pilot is the poet. And to that degree we'll say it that the artist or the poet is in fact, I think, the pilot of democracy, the center point of democracy. For Whitman, much like for some of those other romantic British writers like Shelley that comes to mind, there's no one more important than the one who makes our songs, the one who provides the battle cry. At 2b, the metaphor of the poet as pilot is one that we will see again, and it kind of culminates actually with "Oh Captain, My Captain," although I mentioned a few moments ago Passage to India, and we'll find ourselves back there again. We saw this idea of the ship and the sea and the water, as we said at Barnegat, and any number of other poems from earlier. At 3a, obviously, we've mentioned "Oh Captain, My Captain," some 25 now poems away. Obviously, in that poem will be set in memories of Lincoln. Lincoln for Whitman is the great pilot. But I want you to think as well about the different ways pilot was being understood in Whitman's day. Think about this. We have Ahab, the great pilot, villain pilot in Moby Dick. That's 1851. So to use this term pilot will be for Whitman's readers a term that they will resonate with on a number of counts. Finally, at 3b, it's a fair question to ask, what artist or poet or musician or accomplished creator is for you your pilot? And the pilot of now our culture. If Whitman is the great pilot of America of his generation, and we would argue ages, centuries hence, who else is there? What Yeats will call in Sailing to Byzantium, monuments of an aging intellect. Who is that for you, and who are the people that are guiding you? I'm guessing for a number of you, reading Whitman now is becoming one of those pilots. Thank you.